9 years of marriage, 9 years of trust, and it all crumbled in a single, unanswered phone call. Vivian Cross, a leading Chicago lawyer, stood motionless in her office, listening to her husband whisper to her best friend, "When the divorce is finalized, you will be the true queen of the Viscari family." But that wasn't the cruelest thing she heard that day. If you enjoyed the story of a woman who shattered an empire without firing a single shot, like now and comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far my story has come. Don't go anywhere. The call lasted 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Vivian Cross knew the exact duration because she stared at the timer on her phone screen the entire time, standing motionless in the center of her office on the 22nd floor of the Harmon and Wells building, watching the seconds climb while her husband's voice came through the speaker with a warmth she hadn't heard him direct at her in years. She hadn't answered the call. It had routed to her phone by accident, Adrian trying to reach her desk line, she assumed, the old number he never deleted, and instead of connecting to her assistant, it connected to her directly, and for the first 3 seconds she heard the ambient noise of his car and thought nothing of it. She was reaching to end the call when she heard the second voice. Celeste. Not the voice of a woman talking to her best friend's husband about business logistics or dinner reservations. The voice of someone utterly at ease, unhurried, intimate in a way that scraped the inside of Vivian's chest like broken glass. "She suspects anything?" Adrian's answer came with a short laugh. "Vivian suspects what I allow her to suspect. That's always been the arrangement." Vivian did not move. She had a legal pad open on her desk, a red pen uncapped in her left hand, and she stood there with the pen poised above a document she would never finish reading, and she did not move for 11 minutes and 43 seconds while the two of them spoke. The divorce would be filed within 60 days, Adrian said. The attorneys were already in place. Not Vivian's firm, obviously, a firm in New York she'd never heard of, partners who understood the kind of arrangements that needed to stay quiet. The asset structures were already reorganized. The offshore accounts she'd never been shown direct access to had been quietly reshuffled 8 months ago, routed through 3 different holding companies in the Cayman Islands, and retitled under names that had no connection to the Viscari family on paper. "She'll fight it," Celeste said. "Let her fight. That's what we need her to do. The more aggressively she litigates, the more it confirms the narrative. The instability narrative. The documentation is already prepared. Her therapist, the one she saw after the miscarriage, his records have been amended. Nothing dramatic. Small notations, a pattern of paranoid ideation, difficulty distinguishing perceived threats from actual ones, periods of emotional dysregulation severe enough to impact professional judgment." Vivian's pen dropped to the floor. She didn't hear it hit the hardwood. "And her firm won't protect her?" "Her firm will do exactly what firms do when one of their partners becomes a liability. They'll distance. Quietly, professionally, with deep regret." Another laugh, quieter this time. "She'll be so busy trying to protect her career and fight the divorce that she won't have the bandwidth to look at anything else." There was a pause, a rustling sound. Then Celeste's voice again, lower, more careful. "And the miscarriage. You're sure that angle holds?" What followed was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Vivian counted them. "That angle holds because I made sure it holds," Adrian said. "I've had 8 years to make sure it holds." Vivian set the phone face down on the desk. She stood there another 90 seconds before she picked it back up. The call had already ended. She looked at the duration in her recent calls log, 11:43, and then she set the phone down again, walked to the glass wall facing Lake Michigan, and pressed her forehead against it. The glass was cold. 40 stories down, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent and mechanical, taxis and pedestrians, and the distant gray churn of the lake in October wind. She watched it without seeing it. Her reflection was a ghost in the glass. Silk blouse, hair pinned back, the composed professional face she'd worn for so long it had stopped feeling like a performance. She breathed, in, hold, out. Her miscarriage had been in the 3rd year of their marriage. 12 weeks along, a Tuesday morning, a cramping that started at the breakfast table and escalated into something she couldn't ignore by the time she reached her car. She'd called Adrian from the hospital after. He'd arrived 2 hours later with flowers and red eyes, and a grief that had seemed, at the time, as genuine as her own. She breathed again. The glass fogged slightly where her mouth was. 8 years. She had grieved that child for 8 years with a man who'd spent 8 years making sure the grief could be used against her. It took Vivian 12 minutes to compose herself well enough to walk out of her office and down the hall to the women's restroom, lock herself in the furthest stall, and allow herself 45 seconds of shaking before she stopped. She ran cold water over her wrists at the sink, looked at herself in the mirror. The face that looked back was familiar. 35 years old, dark eyes, the kind of bone structure that made senior partners take her seriously in rooms full of men who'd rather not. But something behind the eyes had shifted in a way she couldn't fully name yet. She thought about crying. She decided against it. Not here. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but certainly not here. Not in the Harmon and Wells building at 2:17 in the afternoon with a client meeting at 4 and 3 open motions on her desk. She walked back to her office, closed the door, and sat down. She opened her laptop. She began to work. Vivian and Adrian Viscari had met at a charity event 9 years ago, one of those circuit events the Chicago money class attended as social obligation, past champagne and strategic conversation in a ballroom at the Langham Hotel. She'd been a rising associate at Harmon and Wells, 26 years old, the kind of sharp that made partners nervous and clients comfortable. He'd been 34, already running the Viscari Group, that name that appeared on half the commercial real estate in the Loop, and another third of the investment portfolios that moved through the city's financial corridors. He was polished, not in the way of men who were performing polish, but in the way of men who had absorbed it so completely it had become structural. He talked to her like she was the only person in the room, without ever making it feel like a technique. She'd been cautious. She'd dated enough successful men to know the difference between interest and acquisition, but Adrian Viscari was patient in a way those other men hadn't been. Patient the way a chess player is patient, she understood now, watching the board rather than the pieces. They married 18 months after they met. The wedding was at a vineyard in Tuscany, 140 guests, a week-long affair that featured in 2 lifestyle publications. Vivian's parents had come from their house in Cincinnati and looked slightly stunned for the entire ceremony, the way good people look when their child steps into a world that's bigger than anything they'd planned for. Celeste had been maid of honor. Celeste Rowan had been Vivian's closest friend since law school. The first year, a contracts class, a study group that started as convenience and deepened into the kind of friendship built on shared exhaustion and mutual respect. She was clever in a sideways fashion, not the direct analytical blade Vivian carried, but something more social, more intuitive, better at reading rooms and adjusting her frequency to match them. She'd made partner at a different firm 3 years ago. She was godmother to no children because Vivian had none. She had attended every birthday, every hard moment, every professional victory with the kind of warmth that had never, until today, given Vivian any reason to examine it. Now, sitting at her desk while October pressed gray against the window, Vivian examined it. She thought about every conversation she'd ever had with Celeste about Adrian, about the marriage, about the miscarriage, about the difficult quarters at the firm, the cases she was struggling with, the clients who complicated her professionally. She thought about what information, specifically, a person could extract from those conversations if they were extracting rather than listening. Quite a lot, she concluded. Quite a lot indeed. She didn't change anything that night. That was the first decision she made consciously, standing at the kitchen island at 7:15 while Adrian was in the shower upstairs and the housekeeper had already gone home, and the house held that particular luxury silence of high ceilings and expensive materials that absorbed sound. She poured 2 glasses of wine. She set his on the counter and held hers and breathed. When Adrian came downstairs, he was wearing a charcoal sweater, and his hair was slightly damp, and he looked the way he always looked. Polished, magnetic, the face she'd looked at across so many dinner tables and boardroom chairs that it had become part of the architecture of her life. And she watched him pick up his wine glass and said nothing. "Long day?" he asked. "Standard," she said. They ate dinner, takeout from the Italian place on Wabash he liked, the one that always sent extra bread. They talked about the upcoming fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, about a renovation project in the River North portfolio, about a dinner they'd been invited to the following Friday. She listened to him speak and watched his mouth and thought about the voice that had come through her phone at 2:17 and looked for the seam between those two versions of the same man. She found it immediately, once she knew to look for it. The seam had always been there. She'd just never had reason to look. "You seem quiet," he said. "Headache," she said. "Probably the Kensington deposition." "Take something." "I will." He touched her hand across the table, brief, automatic, the gesture of a man who understood the maintenance of intimacy the way he understood the maintenance of anything else. And she let him, and smiled, and poured more wine. That night, after he was asleep, she lay on her side of the bed and stared at the ceiling and made a second decision. She was not going to react. She was not going to confront. She was not going to hire a private investigator, consult a divorce attorney, call her sister in Portland, or do any of the things a woman in her position was expected to do. Not because she was passive, because she was a lawyer. And lawyers, the ones who actually won, did not move until they understood the full shape of the territory. She needed to understand the full shape of the territory. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a long time. The Viscari group occupied the top 4 floors of a building on South Michigan Avenue, and in the 9 years of their marriage, Vivian had been invited into Adrian's professional world with the selective visibility of a window that only opened from one side. She knew the surface architecture, the investment funds, the real estate holdings, the philanthropic arm that generated excellent press coverage and apparently excellent tax structures. She'd even done legal work for 3 of the group's subsidiaries, the kind of transactional work that appeared on its face perfectly routine. Now she looked at that work differently. She began staying later at the office. Not conspicuously, she'd always kept long hours, but she restructured those hours, redirecting focus from her active caseload to a parallel project she kept on a personal laptop she'd purchased cash at a Best Buy on a Tuesday afternoon, a device that had never connected to the Harmon and Wells network, and never would. She started with public filings, Secretary of State records, SEC disclosures, Cook County property records. She was methodical and patient, and she worked the way she'd learned to work in her first years as an associate, building a picture one document at a time, trusting the process, not chasing the narrative, but letting the facts construct it. What the facts constructed over the first 3 weeks was a geography of complexity that would have been impressive if it hadn't made her stomach turn. The Viscari Group's legitimate holdings were real. She'd verified enough of them to confirm they generated actual revenue, but they were also containers. Structures built not just to hold wealth, but to move it, to launder it through layers of authentic-looking business activity before it emerged, cleaned on the other end. The subsidiary she'd done transaction work for, a commercial property management company in Schaumburg, she traced to a holding entity she'd never been shown, which connected to a Cayman Islands trust that moved funds in patterns that had no plausible, legitimate explanation. She found 6 such structures in the first 3 weeks. She stopped being surprised by the 7th and 8th. What she couldn't find yet, what lived behind the structures rather than within them, was the source. The nature of the underlying activity that generated the capital being laundered. She had shapes without substance. She needed the substance. She was careful, meticulous about what she searched, from which devices, through which networks. She used public library computers for anything she wasn't comfortable tracking back to herself. She paid cash for coffees and sat in Logan Square and Hyde Park cafes with the personal laptop and worked without connecting to any network she didn't control. She was 3 weeks into this when she found the name Owen Mercer. It came up in a legal database search, a civil case from 2009, a wrongful termination claim brought by a former federal agent against the Bureau after a 17-year organized crime investigation was terminated without explanation, the agent arguing the termination was retaliatory following pressure applied by unnamed political figures in the Northern District of Illinois. The case had settled. The records were partially sealed, but enough remained public that she could see the shape of what the investigation had been. An unidentified criminal organization operating primarily in Chicago with tentacles across 6 Midwest states, controlling interests in labor, transportation, real estate, and financial services, The leadership so thoroughly insulated by legal architecture that despite nearly 2 decades of investigation, the Bureau had never been able to penetrate the upper hierarchy. The agent's name was Owen Mercer. He'd been 51 at the time of the case. He was retired now, presumably. She searched him separately, carefully, found an address in Bridgeport, found no current professional affiliations. She thought about that name for a week before she did anything with it. Meanwhile, she kept the performance going and found, to her own grim surprise, that it was not as difficult as she'd anticipated. This was either a professional asset or a warning sign about her own emotional architecture, and she chose, for now, not to examine which. She attended the Lakeshore Medical Benefit with Adrian. She wore the emerald dress he liked and stood at his side and worked the room the way they always worked rooms together. Complimentary, polished, two people who understood the social function of appearing happy. She watched Celeste across the ballroom talking to a city councilman and felt something cold and precise replace what would have previously been warmth, and she smiled and clinked her champagne glass against the wife of a federal judge and said something that made the woman laugh. Celeste made her way over eventually. She always did. "Vivian, you look extraordinary." "So do you," Vivian said, and meant neither. They embraced with the practiced ease of people who'd been embracing for 14 years, and Vivian felt the other woman's hand on her back and thought about the word betrayal and found it insufficient. Betrayal implied someone who'd started on your side. She wasn't sure Celeste had ever been on her side. She wasn't sure she could trust her own memory on that point anymore. "You seem different," Celeste said, pulling back, studying her face with those searching green eyes. "Are you sleeping?" "Fine," Vivian said. "The Kensington case is running long. You know how depositions go." "I do." A pause, a smile. "You push too hard sometimes, Viv. You always have." "Probably," Vivian agreed. Later that night, lying awake again while Adrian slept beside her with the deep, even breathing of a man with an uncomplicated conscience, she replayed the encounter and cataloged what she'd said, what she'd revealed, what surface she'd given Celeste to read. She found nothing she regretted. She was getting better at this. She contacted Owen Mercer on a Thursday morning in November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. She used a prepaid phone she'd purchased in Evanston and a name that wasn't hers, and she sent a text message that said only, "I have documentation related to a Chicago organized crime investigation that was closed in 2009. I'm told you spent 20 years on it. I need to meet." He responded in 4 hours. "Who gave you my name?" She wrote back, "Public court records, your wrongful termination suit. Are you available?" A longer pause this time. Then, 2 days from now, noon, the Vienna Beef on Western in Bridgeport. Come alone and don't bring anything digital." She left her phone and her laptop at the office and took the Red Line south and walked 12 minutes from the station to a hot dog stand on a November street that smelled like sport peppers and exhaust. And she sat across from a man who was 63 years old and looked like he'd been assembled from the kind of material that didn't break easily. Heavy-boned, gray at the temples, with eyes that moved in the practiced way of people who'd spent decades looking for threats, and found them often enough to keep looking. He looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. "You're not law enforcement." "I'm an attorney." "Who represents?" "Right now, nobody. I'm here personally." He nodded slowly, not like he was accepting that answer, but like he was filing it for later. "What documentation are we talking about?" She took a breath. "Cayman Islands trusts, Cook County shell structures, 18 months of financial transaction records showing fund movement through at least 8 subsidiary entities, all traceable to a single upper-level holding company. I also have," she paused, "identity. The name of the person at the top of the organization you investigated." Something shifted in his face, small, controlled, but she'd spent 9 years learning to read the faces of men who didn't want to be read. "You know who it is," he said. "I know who it is." A long silence. He looked out the window at Western Avenue. A CTA bus moved past, throwing diesel into the gray November air. "Why come to me?" he said finally. "You're a lawyer. You know where federal buildings are located." Because I don't know yet who inside those buildings is compromised, she said. You spent 20 years building a case that was shut down. I need someone who has the same interest I have in making sure this doesn't get buried again. He looked back at her. And what's your interest? She met his eyes. The man at the top of this organization is my husband, she said. And in approximately 8 weeks, he plans to destroy my life, take everything I have, and then eliminate me. Owen Mercer set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then, tell me everything. But she told him almost everything. She held back 3 things: the specific location of the documentation she'd compiled, the name of the Cayman Trust that was the structural keystone, and the detail about the amended therapy records. Those she kept because she'd learned, in 20 minutes of sitting across from Owen Mercer, that he was trustworthy in the specific way that useful people are trustworthy. Not because he had no agenda, but because his agenda aligned with hers sufficiently that the distinction didn't yet matter. She would need to evaluate the degree of that alignment before she gave him the architecture's load-bearing walls. He listened without interrupting. He had a small spiral notebook that he didn't open, just left it on the table between them like a formality. And he listened with the focused stillness of someone who had spent decades extracting information from unreliable narrators and had learned to separate signal from noise at the structural level. When she finished, he was quiet for perhaps 30 seconds. You're still living with him, he said. Yes. He doesn't know you know. No. You've been running this investigation from inside the marriage. Yes. He exhaled slowly through his nose. That's either very disciplined or very stupid. I haven't decided which. It's disciplined, she said. I don't have the luxury of stupid. He's going to run surveillance on you before the divorce files. He'll be looking for exactly this kind of activity. Unauthorized research, outside contacts. I know. I've been operating on the assumption that my office is monitored and my personal devices are compromised. Everything I've done has been through channels he can't access. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. He looked at her steadily. Are you doing this because you want justice or because you want to win? She didn't look away from him. I'm doing this because the man I was married to spent 8 years using my miscarriage as a weapon to build a legal case for my incompetence, she said. And then I'm going to burn everything he built to the ground. You can call that whatever you want. Owen Mercer picked up his coffee cup, looked into it, set it back down. I need to verify what you've given me independently before I move on anything, he said. The trust structure especially. If what you're saying is accurate, we have a window here, but it's narrow. And if he gets any indication that someone's putting this together, the documentation will vanish and so will we. I understand. You need to go home tonight and act normal. I've been acting normal for 6 weeks, she said. I think I have the pattern down. He nodded, and for the first time something that might have been respect, or at least its predecessor, moved through his expression. I'll be in touch in 48 hours, he said. Different number, don't save it. She left the hot dog stand and walked back up Western toward the L and felt the November wind coming off the lake, cutting through her coat, and she thought about the vault. Adrian's private vault. She hadn't mentioned it yet. She'd known about its existence for years. A biometric locked room on the 44th floor of the Michigan Avenue building, the floor that didn't appear on the building's public directory. She'd been inside it once, briefly, 4 years ago, when he'd shown her a piece of art he'd purchased. A small canvas. She'd thought it was a Hockney, but he hadn't confirmed. And she'd stood in that room and looked at the shelves of bound ledgers and the server rack in the corner and the fireproof filing cabinets and thought nothing of it because she'd had no reason to. She had reason now. Whatever documentation existed in the world that could confirm the full scope of the Viscari operation, not the shell company paper trail she'd reconstructed herself, but the internal records, the operational ledgers, the communications that connected the financial architecture to the underlying criminal activity, it was in that room, and she had no idea yet how to get inside it. The L train came. She got on. The car was half full with the late morning crowd. Nurses in scrubs, a construction worker with orange clay on his boots, a teenage boy with headphones who was sleeping against the window. Ordinary people moving through ordinary Thursday afternoon. The city passing outside the scratched windows. She had 48 hours before Owen Mercer called back. She needed to figure out how to access a biometric vault on a floor that didn't officially exist. She closed her eyes and thought about Adrian's schedule for the following week, about the charity gala already in the calendar for January. The one he was using as the announcement vehicle, she understood now. The coronation of Celeste and the disposal of Vivian, the capstone of a plan 9 years in the making. And she thought about the wedding necklace in her jewelry box, the one he'd given her on their first anniversary, a strand of diamonds he'd told her was a Viscari family piece. And she thought about what it would mean to wear that necklace into a room full of his allies while everything he'd built was already on fire. She thought she might like that. She thought she might like that very much. The train crossed the river and dove underground, and the city vanished, and in the sudden dark of the tunnel, Vivian Cross opened her eyes and started to plan. Owen Mercer called back in 36 hours, not 48. Vivian was in the middle of a deposition when the prepaid phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She'd worn the coat specifically because it had an interior pocket deep enough to muffle vibration, and she excused herself for 3 minutes, told opposing counsel she needed water, walked to the hallway outside the conference room, and stood with her back against the wall and her voice very low. "You verified it," she said. Not a question. "Enough of it." His voice was flat, careful. "The Schomburg entity is exactly what you said. I have a contact at FinCEN, someone I trust from before." I ran the transaction patterns past him without attribution. He confirmed the structuring signature matches a methodology they've seen before in 3 other investigations. All 3 went cold. How cold? Evidence room cold. The kind of cold that doesn't happen by itself. She pressed the back of her head against the wall. Down the hall, through the glass partition, she could see opposing counsel refilling his own water glass, checking his watch. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Deposition in room 4. Chicago practicing law on itself. "We need to talk about the vault," she said. A pause. "What vault?" "Michigan Avenue building, 44th floor. It doesn't appear on the building directory. Biometric access. His palm print, I think, possibly a secondary code. I've been inside it once. 4 years ago." "You're telling me the primary documentation is in a location that requires his biometrics to access?" "I'm telling you it's one location. I don't know if it's the only one." "Vivian." He used her name for the first time. "I need you to think carefully before you answer this. Is there any scenario, any legitimate scenario, in which you would have reason to access that floor?" She thought about it for exactly 5 seconds. "His assistant sometimes routes documents to a holding office on 44 when the executive floors are full during peak filing periods. It's happened twice that I know of. That's thin. Everything I'm working with is thin. That's the nature of working from the inside." Another pause. Longer. She could hear traffic on his end. He was outside somewhere, or near an open window. "I need 3 weeks, he said. "Don't move on the vault yet. I need to build the federal framework before we touch it, or everything inside it becomes inadmissible and we've done nothing except warn him. He files the divorce in 8 weeks. He's already restructured the offshore accounts. Every week you wait keeps you alive," Owen said. "Go back to your deposition." She went back to her deposition. She sat across from a corporate CFO for another 4 hours and dismantled his accounting logic with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who had nothing else on her mind. And when she walked out of the building at 6:15, the November dark had already come down over Michigan Avenue, and she stood on the sidewalk and felt the wind and felt absolutely nothing, which was either composure or the beginning of something she'd have to deal with later. She decided it was composure and got in a cab. 3 things happened in the 2 weeks that followed, each of them separately small and together significant. The first was a conversation with Celeste. They had lunch at a restaurant in the West Loop, Celeste's suggestion, a place with exposed brick and a wine list that justified the prices. Vivian had agreed immediately, because declining would have been a deviation from pattern, and she was meticulous about pattern. She ordered the same thing she always ordered. She laughed at the same moments she would have laughed at before. She performed 14 years of friendship, with the fluency of someone who understood now that performance was what it had always been, at least from one side of the table. Celeste was fishing. Vivian recognized it within the first 10 minutes, but the way the conversation kept circling back to Adrian, to the marriage, to whether Vivian had noticed any distance lately, any change in his patterns. The concern deployed with the perfect calibration of a close friend who'd noticed something and wanted to raise it carefully. "He seems distracted," Celeste said, swirling her wine. "At the benefit last week, I thought, I don't know, maybe it's the Meridian deal. Is that still running complicated?" "You know Adrian," Vivian said. "He doesn't bring work home." "No, I suppose he doesn't." A small pause. "Are you two okay?" "We're fine." "You'd tell me." "Celeste." Vivian met her eyes and smiled. "We're fine." Celeste held the look for a beat too long, the fraction of a second that separated genuine concern from assessment, and then smiled back and changed the subject to a renovation she was planning for her River North condo. And Vivian listened and contributed and ate her lunch and thought about what specifically Celeste had been sent to determine. Whether Vivian knew. That was the only question. Everything else was scaffolding around that question. She'd given her nothing, she was certain of it, but the lunch told her something she hadn't confirmed before. Celeste wasn't a passive recipient of information. She was an active participant, deployed, directed, reporting back. She wasn't a woman who'd fallen into an affair with a married man and gotten in deeper than she intended. She was a collaborator, had been for years. Perhaps from the beginning. Vivian tipped 22% and told Celeste she looked wonderful and walked back to her office and sat down and thought about 14 years of friendship and felt the cold precision that had replaced grief, hardened into something more permanent. The second thing was what she found in the Meridian files. She hadn't been looking for it specifically. She'd been running a financial trace on a subsidiary she'd identified the previous week, a logistics company in Gary, Indiana that appeared to exist primarily on paper. And the trail led through a series of intermediary entities to a transaction set that connected, unexpectedly, to legal work she recognized. Her own firm's billing codes, her own matter number, the Meridian deal. The commercial acquisition she'd handled 18 months ago, a straightforward property transaction for what she'd been told was a Vescari Group subsidiary pursuing legitimate commercial expansion in the South Side. She'd done the due diligence. She'd cleared the ownership structure. She'd signed off on the title insurance. She sat with the document on her personal laptop in a Hyde Park coffee shop and went through it 3 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. The property she'd facilitated the acquisition of had subsequently been used, according to the financial records she'd traced, as collateral for a loan structure that had moved approximately $12 million through 3 shell entities in 9 months. The money's origin, based on the transaction patterns Owen's FinCEN contact had described, was not legitimate. She had cleared that property. Her legal work was in the chain of title. She was not just the unknowing wife of a criminal. She was potentially a link in the operational chain. Whether intentionally or not, and it was not intentional, she was absolutely certain it was not intentional, her professional work had been used as cover. This was what engineered from the beginning meant, she understood now. Not just the marriage as a social cover. The marriage as a mechanism for inserting a legitimate attorney's work product into the operational infrastructure. Every deal she'd touched, every subsidiary she'd cleared, every title she'd signed off on. She closed the laptop and sat very still and listened to the coffee shop around her. The espresso machine, someone's playlist leaking from their headphones, a conversation about a parking ticket. And she thought about what Adrian had built, and she thought about how precisely, how deliberately she had been assembled into it. Her hands were flat on the table. She looked at them. Then she opened the laptop and kept working. The third thing was the car. She noticed it on a Wednesday evening, walking from the Harmon and Wells building to the parking garage on Wacker. A gray sedan, domestic, parked at a metered spot with its engine running and nobody visibly in it except a shape behind the tinted windshield that could have been a headrest or a person. She walked past it and noted the plate number without looking like she was noting the plate number, a skill she'd developed in the past 6 weeks by practicing it in low-stakes situations until it became automatic. She found the same plate in the parking garage the following morning. Different level, different spot. Engine off this time. Empty. She did not change her route. She did not vary her schedule. She went about 3 completely ordinary days with the knowledge that someone was watching her, and on the 4th day she called Owen Mercer from the prepaid phone while sitting in the food court of the Millennium Station, surrounded by enough ambient noise to defeat any directional microphone that wasn't close enough to be visible. "I'm being surveilled," she said. "How long?" 3 days confirmed, possibly longer before I noticed. "The car?" "Registered to a security consulting firm in Naperville. I ran the entity. It's a shell. It exists, it has a website, but the principal listed is a name I can't verify as a real person." "It's one of his." "I assumed." "Okay." She could hear him thinking through the silence. "He's running pre-divorce surveillance. This is standard for what he's doing. He needs documentation of behavior he can characterize as unstable or financially irregular. It's consistent with the therapy record amendment. He's building the package." How much time does that give us? If he's at the documentation gathering stage, you're probably 4 to 6 weeks from the filing, maybe less. You said you needed 3 weeks. I said I needed 3 weeks before we touched the vault. I've been moving faster than that. A pause. I have a federal contact, but not FinCEN, higher, who I trust because I have the same kind of material on him that he has on me. We've been in contact for 6 days. He's interested. But he needs the vault, Vivian. He needs primary source documentation, not reconstructed financial traces. Without what's in that room, we have a compelling circumstantial case and very good lawyers on the other side who will take it apart in discovery. I know. I need you to get inside that vault. She looked at the food court around her, a family eating McDonald's, a businessman on his phone, a teenager with a skateboard under his arm buying a Coke, the ordinary cross-section of a city that had no idea what moved underneath it. "Give me a week," she said. Touch. She'd been thinking about the vault for 2 weeks already, and what she'd settled on was not a plan so much as a sequence of observations that, assembled correctly, created a narrow window. Adrian's palm print controlled the door, but the door also had a secondary authentication, a 6-digit code entered on a panel beside the biometric reader. She knew this because she'd watched him enter it 4 years ago, standing slightly behind him in the corridor outside the room, and she'd registered the hand movement without consciously cataloging it at the time. The way you absorb things at the edges of attention. Over the past week, she'd reconstructed the movement sequence in her memory, working backward from the physical memory of watching him. The angle of his hand, the rhythm of the keystrokes, the position of his wrist. She was fairly confident the code was 417892. Fairly confident was not the same as certain, and a wrong entry would log the attempt and possibly trigger an alert. But the code was only one problem. The palm print was the other problem. And the palm print was not a problem she could solve the same way. What she could solve was access to the floor. The holding office routing she'd mentioned to Owen, she'd verified carefully that it was still an active procedure. Adrian's assistant, a meticulous young man named Derek, who Vivian had always liked and now regarded with new caution, routed overflow document deliveries to Suite 4402 when the 47th floor was in heavy use. The last routing had been 6 weeks ago. She'd found the email chain in the firm's document management system while searching for the Meridian files. She needed to be on that floor with a reason to be there, and she needed Adrian's palm print, or rather, she needed the door open without triggering a security alert that would reach him before she was out. She thought about this for several days, and then she thought about it differently and realized she'd been approaching it from the wrong direction. She didn't need his palm print. She needed him to open the door himself. She chose a Sunday afternoon in late November, 3 days before Thanksgiving. She'd spent 2 weeks constructing the sequence and testing each component separately, the way she tested legal arguments, not as a coherent whole, but as individual elements, each one stress-tested for failure modes before being assembled into the final structure. She told Adrian she needed to retrieve a document from Derek's secondary filing system. A real document, a real reason, something related to the Meridian acquisition that she'd confirmed Derek had physically filed on 44 during a backup period. She mentioned it over breakfast, casually, the way she'd learned to deploy information around Adrian, embedded in the ordinary, attached to something he could verify, stripped of any quality that would make it register as significant. "I thought Derek handled your retrieval requests," Adrian said, not looking up from his phone. "He does, but he's off Sunday and the Kensington team needs the Meridian closing binder by Monday morning. I'll just run over." A pause. 2 seconds. She counted them while spreading butter on toast and looking at the Tribune. "I'll come with you," Adrian said. "I need to pull something from upstairs anyway." She looked up. "You don't have to. It's fine." He set his phone down. "We can get lunch after." She said that sounded nice. Botchk. The Michigan Avenue building was quiet on a Sunday. Security in the lobby, 2 maintenance workers on the lower floors, the particular echo of a high-rise operating at 1/5 capacity. They rode the elevator in a companionable silence that Vivian had spent 9 years constructing and now experienced as the surface of something with no bottom. On 44, Adrian moved toward his own corridor, the one that angled north away from the document suite, and Vivian went to suite 4402 and let herself in with the access code Derek had given her 2 years ago and which still worked. She found the Meridian binder. She also placed, on the shelf beside where the binder had been, a small device the size of a thumb drive that Owen had given her 5 days ago, and which she had not asked him to explain in technical detail because she did not need the technical detail. She needed only to know it was in the room. She was back in the corridor with the binder in 40 seconds. She waited. From the north corridor, she heard the sound she'd been waiting for, the soft hydraulic click of the vault door releasing. Adrian retrieving whatever he needed to retrieve. She walked toward the sound with the binder under her arm, timing it, and rounded the corner as the vault door was swinging open. "Oh, I thought you were going upstairs," she said. Adrian turned. He was holding a slim leather portfolio. His expression moved through something. Not suspicion exactly, more like calibration, before settling into the neutrality she recognized as his default. "Changed my mind," he said. "I keep the Harmon correspondence down here." "Harmon correspondence?" She let the question be light, incidental. "I didn't know we had outstanding old files." He pulled the vault door closed behind him. The lock re-engaged with a sound like a clock finishing its mechanism. "Ready for lunch?" "Ready," she said. She smiled at him. He smiled back. They took the elevator down together and ate at a French place on Erie Street, and he ordered the duck and she ordered the salmon, and they talked about Thanksgiving plans and a friend's engagement and whether they should redo the kitchen in the house on Astor Street, and she kept the smile in place and the warmth calibrated and watched his hands on the table and thought about the device now sitting on the shelf in suite 4402 and what it was doing in the silence of the 44th floor while they ate their Sunday lunch. Owen called her that evening. "It worked," he said. "What did we get?" The device captured the access sequence, code, and biometric registration signature. The code is 417829. She'd had 2 of the digits transposed. She filed that away. "The biometric signature, can we replicate it?" "Not in any way I'd want to explain to a federal judge." A pause. "But I spoke to my contact today, full conversation. He's prepared to move, Vivian, but he wants a coordinated operation. Not just the vault documentation, he wants simultaneous action across all the structural elements. Financial, operational, personnel, the full architecture in one sweep." "When?" "He's suggesting late January. There's a window after the holidays when the Bureau's Organized Crime Division rotates supervisory personnel. His team comes in, the prior team, the ones he believes are compromised, are on leave. Adrian's gala is January 18th. I know. He's announcing the divorce at the gala. If we move before that, we can't move before that. We need the full documentation out of the vault before we move, and we can't access the vault without his palm print." She stood at the window of her home office. Adrian was downstairs, she could hear the television, and looked out at the dark of the Astor Street garden and thought about January 18th, about the ballroom Adrian was already booking, about Celeste, in whatever dress she'd selected for the occasion of becoming the Viscari Queen. "There might be a way to get him to open the vault again," she said, "in a context where we can access it after. In a context where he opens it and leaves it accessible long enough for a federal team to get inside." What context? She'd been thinking about this for 2 days. It had come to her in the specific way that the best legal strategies came, not as inspiration, but as the logical conclusion of following the evidence far enough. The gala, she said. He'll need documentation from the vault before the gala. He's going to have federal agents looking at him the moment the divorce is public. He knows that. He'll want his most sensitive materials either destroyed or moved to a location he controls more completely. The week before the gala, he'll go into that vault to prepare. And we intercept the access window. We have your federal team inside the vault within hours. They document and copy everything, and every piece of evidence is authenticated and in federal custody before the gala happens. And then I walk into the gala, she said, and I let him have his announcement. Owen was quiet for a moment. You want to be in the room when it happens. I need to be in the room when it happens. That's not operational necessity, Vivian. That's personal. Yes, she said. It is. He exhaled. She could hear him weighing it. The tactical risk against the thing he'd heard in her voice. The quality she'd been careful to keep out of her voice for 6 weeks, but which had come through anyway. The way things come through when you've been carrying them long enough. We'll discuss it, he said finally. We'll do more than discuss it. I said we'll discuss it. She let it go. For now. Us. She made one mistake in December. It was small. She was almost certain it was small. She'd been at the office late, a genuine work emergency, a client in crisis, the kind of Thursday night that had nothing to do with her parallel investigation. And she'd left her personal laptop in her bag and her bag in her office while she was in a conference room for 3 hours. And when she came back, the bag was where she'd left it, and the laptop was where she'd left it. But the laptop was slightly warm. It might have been the ambient heat of the office. It might have been nothing. She transferred everything off the personal laptop that night, onto a drive she kept in a safety deposit box at a bank Adrian had no account at, and she factory reset the device. And she told herself it was nothing, and then spent 2 days walking through what was on that laptop at the time, and what, if anything, could be extracted from it that Adrian didn't already know or couldn't have guessed. The shell company documentation, the FinCEN transaction traces, 3 drafts of a memo she'd written to herself about the vault sequence. She thought about the memo. She thought about what specifically she'd written in it. She thought about Adrian at the breakfast table 2 Sundays ago, looking at his phone, saying, I'll come with you without looking up. She thought about the timing of that. She sat in the safety deposit room of the bank on a Wednesday afternoon with the metal box open on the table in front of her and thought very carefully about whether she'd been outmaneuvered and by how much and what it meant for the sequence she'd built. She couldn't be sure. That was the problem. She couldn't be sure whether the laptop had been accessed or not, and uncertainty at this stage of the operation was a structural flaw she couldn't afford. She called Owen from the prepaid phone that evening. I may have had a compromise, she said. Silence on his end. Then, define may have. My personal device was potentially accessed while unattended. I've cleared it. But if they pulled the vault memo, what was in the memo? The access code, the date we were on 44 together, the device placement. A longer silence. If he knows, Owen said slowly, then he knows you know, and the timeline changes. I know. He won't wait for January. He'll move faster. I know. Vivian. His voice had changed, not alarm exactly, but the frequency of a man who had spent 20 years on the edge of catastrophic situations recalibrating for a new variable. If he knows, then you are not safe in that house. She stood in the kitchen of the house on Astor Street. Upstairs, she could hear Adrian's footsteps. He'd come home an hour ago, changed, made a call she hadn't been able to hear from the floor below. The house was warm. The kitchen smelled like the remnants of dinner she'd made herself, and the candle she always lit on the counter near the window. She listened to his footsteps. He doesn't know, she said. Not yet. If he did, the behavior would have changed. He's careful. He'd adjust. You can't. I know this man, she said. I have watched this man for 9 years, and I know what his adjustments look like. He hasn't adjusted. But you think the laptop was accessed? I think it's possible. Then we are operating on borrowed time, and borrowed time has a And then the kitchen door opened. Adrian stood in the doorway in his shirt and trousers, a glass of water in his hand, and he looked at her, at the prepaid phone pressed to her ear, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not suspicion, recognition. "I'll call you back," she said, and lowered the phone. Adrian set his water glass on the counter with a precise, controlled movement. "Who are you talking to?" he said. She held his eyes. The kitchen was very quiet. "My sister," she said. "She's having a hard time with the pregnancy." He looked at the phone in her hand, then back at her face. "That's not your phone," he said. "That's not your phone," he said. The kitchen held the silence the way expensive rooms hold silence, completely, with no ambient noise to hide behind. The candle on the counter threw a small, warm circle that didn't reach the doorway where Adrian stood, and in the shadow at the edge of that light, his face was a study in controlled stillness that Vivian recognized now for what it actually was. Not composure, calculation. She didn't move, didn't adjust her weight or shift her grip on the phone, or do any of the small physical things that people do when they've been caught and their body knows it before their mind catches up. She was very still, and she held his eyes, and she said, "I dropped mine in the parking garage yesterday, cracked the screen. I've been using a backup until the replacement comes." It was a good lie. It was the kind of lie that was good because it was specific and ordinary and slightly embarrassing. The kind of thing you'd mention to your husband, except you'd forgotten to mention it because cracked phone screens are trivial. And the slight defensive edge in her voice was the edge of someone who finds the question mildly insulting rather than alarming. Adrian looked at the phone for 2 more seconds. Then he picked up his water glass and said, "You should get a case." "I know," she said. He went back upstairs. She stood in the kitchen and counted to 60 before she breathed correctly again. Then she looked at the prepaid phone in her hand and thought about the expression that had crossed Adrian's face in the doorway. That fractional moment of recognition before he deployed the question. And she thought about what he'd been looking for and whether the lie had given it to him or denied it. She genuinely didn't know. That was the worst part. After 6 weeks of operating with the cold precision of someone who knew the territory, she was standing in her own kitchen, genuinely uncertain whether her husband had just accepted her explanation or filed it away in a category that would have consequences. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs and got into bed beside him and lay in the dark and listened to him breathe. She called Owen the next morning from the street, walking 4 blocks from the house before she stopped under an awning on North State and kept her voice below the wind. "We had a moment last night," she said. "He saw the phone." "What did you tell him?" "Cracked screen, backup device. He accepted it, I think." "You think?" "He didn't push. His behavior this morning was normal, but normal for Adrian is a performance I can't read all the way through anymore." "Okay." Owen's voice was tight. "I'm moving the federal contact timeline up. He's been building the legal framework. He can file a preliminary injunction on the Vescari financial structures within 72 hours if I give him what he needs. But Vivian, for that, I need the vault. We're back to the same problem." "I know." "If Adrian is suspicious, if he runs a security audit on 44, the device you left in suite 4402 is exposed. If he finds it, he won't know what it is. He'll know it didn't belong there." She closed her eyes briefly. The wind off the lake was sharp and direct, and she leaned into it slightly, the way she'd learned to lean into things that pushed back. "I need 2 weeks, she said. "You said that last time." "I know what I said. 2 weeks. I have an idea for the vault access, and I need time to build the components." A pause on his end. She heard a door close. He was going inside somewhere quieter. "What's the idea?" he said. "Not on the phone. Can you meet Wednesday?" "Same place?" "Different place. I'll text you." She put the prepaid phone in her coat pocket and walked the 4 blocks back to the house and went inside and made coffee. And when Adrian came downstairs, she handed him his cup and said, "Replacing phone today, by the way. Finally." He said, "Good," and opened the Tribune. Wednesday came and went. She met Owen at a diner in Pilsen, a corner booth, the kind of place with laminate tables and coffee that came automatically, and a noise level that made directional surveillance impractical. She laid it out for him. She'd identified a pattern in Adrian's schedule that put him in the Michigan Avenue building on Saturdays for approximately 4 hours, mid-morning, a pattern consistent enough over the past 6 weeks that she was confident it was structural rather than coincidental. Saturday was when he managed the organizational side of the operation, not the legitimate business, the other business. The day his security detail was reduced because a full detail on a Saturday attracted the kind of attention a reduced one didn't. "He'll be in the vault on the Saturday before the gala," she said. "January 15th. He'll need to move documentation before the announcement triggers scrutiny. That's our window. Not before, not after." Owen wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "January 15th gives us 3 days before the gala. 3 days for your federal contact to position his team. Is that enough? It's tight. Everything about this is tight." He looked at her across the table. The diner light was flat and fluorescent and unkind, and she sat in it without self-consciousness, the same way she sat in deposition rooms, present, undecorated, not performing anything. "You said you had an idea for the access," he said. "Adrian has a physical therapy appointment every Thursday at 6. He leaves the building through the Wabash entrance. I've confirmed this 3 times. His security detail does a vehicle sweep in the parking structure at 5:50, which means there's a 10-minute window where the 44th floor has no active security personnel. That's not vault access, that's a window. The window is how we get the device off the shelf in Suite 4402 without triggering the electronic log. And it's how we replace it with a new device, one your contact's team program specifically to capture the full biometric sequence the next time Adrian accesses the vault, not just the access code." Owen was quiet for a moment. "How do you get onto the floor during that window?" "Derek's access code to Suite 4402 still works. I tested it last week." "Vivian." He set the cup down. "You went back to 44. I retrieved a document. I was on the floor for 4 minutes. You can't—" "I know the risk," she said. "I've been calculating risk for 8 weeks. Can your contact's team build the new device in time?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took out his spiral notebook, the one he never wrote in, and opened it for the first time and wrote something she couldn't see from across the table. "I'll ask him," he said. The device was ready in 6 days. She retrieved the old one and placed the new one on a Thursday evening in December, 11 minutes from entry to exit, using the stairwell rather than the elevator on the way out and walking 3 blocks north on Michigan before hailing a cab. When she got home, Adrian's car was in the garage and the house lights were on, and she walked inside and said she'd been at Whole Foods and held up the grocery bag she'd purchased for exactly this reason. And he said hungry, and she said starving, and they ate leftovers at the kitchen island, and she told him about a partner at the firm who was having a protracted custody dispute, and he told her about a property deal in Fulton Market, and neither of them said anything that meant anything, and afterward she washed the dishes, and he watched the news, and the evening passed the way evenings passed. She had 3 weeks until January 15th. On the 22nd of December, 4 days before Christmas, she went to Celeste's holiday party. She almost didn't. The case for not going was rational. Every interaction with Celeste was now a performance that consumed energy she needed to conserve, and the performance had to be flawless because Celeste, she'd come to understand, was better at reading people than almost anyone Vivian had ever met. That social fluency, that instinctive frequency matching, it wasn't a neutral gift. It was a tool. But not going would be a deviation from pattern, and she was meticulous about pattern. So she went. She wore a black dress and arrived with a bottle of wine and embraced 14 people she knew to varying degrees of intimacy and drank 2 glasses of Burgundy over 3 hours and kept herself at the pleasant middle distance of someone enjoying a party without being at the center of it. Celeste's apartment was River North, 32nd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass looking north toward Lincoln Park and the dark mass of the lake beyond. 200 people in white and black, the ambient noise of a room full of professionals in December being professionally festive. A pianist in the corner. Catering staff in gray aprons moving through the crowd with geometric precision. She was talking to a federal appeals court clerk, a perfectly ordinary conversation about a restaurant in Wicker Park. When she saw him, she didn't recognize him immediately. He was across the room, near the window, talking to a man she didn't know. And the first thing she registered was not his face but his posture. The specific weight distribution of someone who occupied space in a room the way people occupy space when they're used to being looked at without staring back. She'd seen that posture before, in depositions, in federal courtrooms. Then he turned slightly and she recognized the jaw, the gray at the temples, the particular set of the shoulders. Her federal contact, Owen's federal contact. The man she'd never met but whose name she knew because Owen had used it twice and she'd memorized it automatically the way she memorized everything relevant. Deputy Director Samuel Kraft, at Celeste's Christmas party. She kept her expression exactly where it was. She laughed at something the court clerk said and touched his arm lightly and said she needed to refresh her drink. And she moved through the party with the patient directional movement of someone who wasn't moving toward anything in particular. And she positioned herself near the kitchen door, where she had a sight line to the window and watched Samuel Kraft talk to the man she didn't know. Celeste appeared at Kraft's elbow 12 minutes later, not as a hostess greeting a guest, as someone greeting a person she knew. The embrace was brief but familiar. They spoke for perhaps 4 minutes, heads slightly inclined toward each other in the posture of people having a quiet conversation in a loud room. Vivian set her wine glass down on a side table and left the party at 10:15. She sat in her car in the parking structure on Huron Street and thought about Samuel Kraft at Celeste's party and thought about the 20 years of investigation that had been shut down without explanation and thought about what Owen had said, the kind of cold that doesn't happen by itself. And she thought about Owen. She thought about Owen very carefully. He had come to her as a retired federal agent with a grievance against the Bureau and a 20-year investment in a case that had been taken from him. He had verified her documentation independently. He had connected her to a federal contact he described as trustworthy, in the specific way useful people are trustworthy. He had guided the operational sequence step by step across 8 weeks. Every step of the operational sequence had required her to provide information, access, and physical presence in the Vescari building. She thought about that. She took out the prepaid phone and looked at it, and thought about Owen's instruction, the first time they met. Don't bring anything digital. She thought about the device on the shelf in Suite 4402. The first one, which she'd placed herself, which Owen had given her. The one that had captured the vault access code and, Owen had told her, the biometric signature. She thought about what else it might have captured, her hand on the shelf, placing it. The document she'd retrieved, her face possibly, if it had a camera component she hadn't been shown, her presence on the 44th floor. On record. On a device she hadn't examined and whose full capabilities she'd accepted on Owen's description. She sat in the parking structure and felt the cold that had nothing to do with December. The cold that settles into the sternum when a structure you've been standing on shifts and you can't tell yet how far it's going to drop. She drove home. She did not call Owen. She spent Christmas acting normal. They went to Adrian's family property in Lake Geneva, a house she'd always found beautiful in the abstract way of things you don't love. 12 rooms on the lake, his brother's family there, Christmas dinner around a table that seated 14. She played the role she'd always played in that family, engaged, warm, slightly outside the innermost circle by marriage rather than blood. She watched Adrian with his nieces and nephews and thought about the man on the phone in November and the man carving turkey in December, and found she could hold both images simultaneously now without the vertigo that would have accompanied that 6 months ago. That was either growth or damage. She still didn't call Owen. She gave herself until New Year's to decide what she knew and what she was going to do about it. On the 29th of December, sitting in the safety deposit room at the bank, with the drive from her cleared laptop on the table in front of her, she made herself construct the worst version of what she'd seen at Celeste's party. Worst version? Owen Mercer was not what he'd presented himself as. The wrongful termination case was real. She'd verified it. But its meaning was different from what she'd assumed. He hadn't been shut down because he was getting too close to the Vescari organization. He'd been shut down because he'd gotten too close to something else, and the settlement that had ended the case had included terms she couldn't access because they were sealed. He'd come out of that case with motivation to appear as an enemy of the Vescari operation. He'd spent years positioning himself as the man the Vescari boss had destroyed professionally. Perfect cover for a man who'd actually been turned. Samuel Kraft at Celeste's party, not a corrupt official who'd been installed to protect Adrian's organization. A corrupt official who was part of it, who Owen had presented to her as the trustworthy federal contact who would take down the Vescari Empire, because that contact was the mechanism for making sure the Vescari Empire survived. What the operation actually accomplished, in the worst version, Vivian provides the financial documentation she'd compiled, the evidence Adrian couldn't have known she'd assembled. Vivian provides access to the 44th floor and places a device that logs not just Adrian's biometrics, but her own presence and movements. Vivian delivers herself to a federal contact who is Adrian's man inside the bureau. The divorce proceeds. The evidence she'd compiled is in Adrian's hands. The documentation of her unauthorized access to his building is in federal hands. The therapy records are amended. The case for Vivian Cross as a paranoid, financially reckless, legally compromised attorney is complete. She sat with that version for a long time. Then she tried to find its holes. The holes were there, but they were small. She'd given Owen real documentation, the shell company records, the FinCEN traces. If he was working for Adrian, those had already been passed back. The offshore structures she'd identified might already be in the process of being dismantled and rebuilt somewhere she hadn't found yet. The window she'd been building toward, January 15th, the vault, the federal team, might be a window that opened onto nothing. Or worse, onto something that closed around her. She thought about the vault memo on the laptop, the one that might have been accessed, the one that had the access code. If Adrian had that code from her memo, he'd changed it already. The new device she'd placed on the 44th floor was capturing a code that didn't exist anymore. She had possibly spent 8 weeks building an operation that had been used against her in real time. She put the drive back in the deposit box and locked it, and sat in the small institutional room and let herself feel it, really feel it, for the first time since October, the full weight of what she was in. Not just a betrayed wife, not just a woman building a case, a person who had been inside a structure she didn't understand, whose exits she could not verify, who had handed the people who wanted to destroy her the tools they needed to do it with institutional legitimacy. She breathed. In. Hold. Out. Then she thought about what she actually knew. Not what she feared, not the worst version, but what she could verify independently without Owen Mercer, without Samuel Kraft, without any of the components she'd been given rather than built herself. The financial documentation was hers. She'd built it herself, verified it herself, from public records and her own legal expertise. Nobody had given her that. The Meridian connection was hers. Her own work, her own discovery. The vault existed. She'd been inside it. That was hers. And there was one more thing, something she hadn't shared with Owen, something she'd held back from the first meeting because she'd learned, in 20 years of legal practice, that the thing you don't put on the table is often the thing that wins the case. She took out her personal phone, the new one, the replacement, which she'd had swept for monitoring software by a security consultant she'd hired under a pretext engagement 2 weeks ago and which had come back clean. And she opened a note she'd made to herself in a folder labeled Kitchen Renovation Quotes. One name, one phone number. A woman she'd never met, but whose existence she'd found in a sealed federal filing from 2014. A witness protection relocation that had been partially declassified as part of a FOIA response she'd submitted under a firm name that wasn't hers. The woman's name, before protection, had been Maria Solis. She'd been an accountant for a logistics company in Gary, Indiana, the same Gary logistics company that appeared as a node in the Vescari financial structure. She'd survived an attempt on her life in 2013. She'd been relocated and given a new identity. Vivian had found the new identity 3 weeks ago. She hadn't told Owen. Maria Solis, now living under a different name in a city she'd verify before she contacted her, was the only person Vivian knew of who had been inside the operational side of the Vescari organization, survived, and was in a position to give testimony. If Owen was compromised, federal channels were compromised. But Maria Solis was not a federal channel. She was a woman who had survived once already. and Vivian was going to need her to survive a second time. She put the phone away and stood up and straightened her coat and walked out of the bank into the December cold. She had 18 days until January 15th. She had no federal backing, a compromised operational partner, and a husband who might already know everything. What she had was the documentation she'd built herself, the name of a witness, and the particular quality of mind that had gotten her to this moment intact. She started walking. She called Owen on the 30th of December. She'd spent 24 hours deciding exactly what she was going to say and how she was going to say it, and she'd built two versions, one for if he was clean, one for if he wasn't, and she held both in her mind simultaneously as she dialed. "I need to see you," she said, "before the new year." "What's happened?" "Nothing yet. I want to review the January 15th sequence." A pause, shorter than she'd expected. "Tomorrow, same diner." "Fine," she said. She arrived early. She took the corner booth with her back to the wall and her sightline to the door, and she ordered coffee and waited. And when Owen Mercer walked in at noon, she watched the way he moved through the diner, who he looked at, whether he paused, whether his eyes went to the windows before they went to her, and she read everything she could read. He sat down. He looked the same as always. He ordered coffee from the waitress without looking at the menu and turned to her and said, "Talk to me." "I saw Samuel Kraft," she said. December 22nd, Celeste Rowan's Christmas party. She watched his face. What she saw was not guilt. It was not calculation. It was a very specific kind of shock. The shock of a person receiving information that contradicts something they believed was true. The instantaneous restructuring of a mental map that had just lost a landmark. That reaction lasted perhaps 1 second before he contained it. But she'd seen it. "What?" he said. "Celeste Rowan's Christmas party. Samuel Kraft was there. Celeste greeted him personally. They spoke for 4 minutes. It wasn't a professional contact." Owen set his coffee cup down and looked at the table. "Owen." He looked up. "Is he compromised?" she said. A long silence, long enough that the waitress came by and refilled her cup and left again. "I don't know," he said. "That's not an answer I can work with. It's the only answer I have." Something had shifted in his face, not the composure that was still in place, but behind it. The particular exhaustion of a man confronting a possibility he'd refused to examine. "I've known Sam Kraft for 22 years. He was the one person inside the bureau I was certain—" "Certainty," she said, "is what they bank on." He looked at her across the laminate table. "If Kraft is theirs," he said slowly, "then everything we've built may already be in Adrian's hands. Yes." "The device on 44. I know. The documentation you gave me. I know." She kept her voice flat and even, "which is why I need to know if you are also theirs." The diner noise continued around them. Coffee machine, conversation, the bell over the door as a customer left. Owen Mercer looked at her, and his face moved through something she couldn't fully catalog, something that had age and damage in it. The face of a man looking at the accumulated cost of 20 years in a single expression. "No," he said. "I need more than no." "I know you do." He reached into his coat and took out his spiral notebook and slid it across the table to her. "That's everything I have. Every contact, every document exchange, every conversation I've had related to this operation, including with Kraft. It's all there. Read it." She looked at the notebook, then she picked it up. She read it for 40 minutes while Owen sat across from her and drank coffee and didn't speak. The diner turned over its lunch crowd around them. She read every page. His handwriting was cramped and precise, the shorthand of someone who'd spent decades taking notes that couldn't be explained if found. She decoded it as she read, building the picture. When she finished, she closed the notebook and set it on the table. "He has a daughter," she said. "Kraft. Sophie, 24, graduate school in Boston." She thought about that for a moment. "The Vescary organization has something on him." "That's my read." "Then he's not fully committed. He's controlled." "Possibly." "Controlled men are negotiating even when they're not in the room." She looked at Owen. "Which means there's a version of this where Kraft wants out. Or a version where he's too deep to want anything except survival." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. We can't use him. We can't use any federal channel he's touched, which means we need a different delivery mechanism for the vault documentation. There are other... I have a witness, she said. Owen went still. An inside witness, someone who was operational, who survived and was relocated. She watched his face carefully. I've known about her for 3 weeks. I didn't tell you. He held her gaze. She could see him absorbing this, the fact of the information and the fact of her having withheld it simultaneously. Maria Solis, he said. She felt the bottom of something fall away. He knew the name. She's dead, he said quietly. January 2019, house fire in her relocation city. The bureau listed it as accidental. The diner continued around her, the coffee machine, the bell over the door. They found her, Owen said. Whoever found her, it wasn't through me. But they found her. Vivian looked at her hands on the table, the last component she'd held back, the last card. The one she'd kept because she'd learned that the thing you don't put on the table is often the thing that wins the case. Gone. Before she'd ever played it. She sat in the corner booth of a diner in Pilsen on the 30th of December and felt the full dimension of what she was facing for the first time without the insulation of forward momentum, without the next step to plan, the next document to pull, the next move to make. Just the bare facts of it. A husband who ran a criminal empire, a federal contact who was controlled by that empire, a witness who was dead, an operation that may have been compromised from the inside, a gala in 18 days where her husband planned to discard her in front of Chicago's elite before eliminating her entirely. She thought about the wedding necklace in her jewelry box, the Viscari family piece, the strand of diamonds she'd worn on their first anniversary while Adrian had looked at her across a candlelit table with the face of a man who had already decided what she was for. She thought about what it would mean to walk into that ballroom. She thought about the documentation she'd built herself, the part that was entirely hers, that nobody had given her, that lived in a safety deposit box at a bank Adrian had no account at. She thought about the Meridian files, her own work product, her own legal signature in the chain of title. She thought about the one thing nobody, not Owen, not Kraft, not Adrian, knew she had. Not a witness, not a device, not a financial trace, a conversation, her phone, her recent calls log. October 14th, 11:43. She had never deleted the call record. She had the number it originated from, and she was a lawyer, and she knew what a subpoena could extract from a carrier record, and she knew which federal agencies operated outside the chains that Samuel Kraft could compromise, and she knew specifically which assistant United States attorney in the Northern District had built her career on financial crime prosecutions and had never, in 12 years of practice, had a case connected to the Viscari organization because she'd never been given one. Her name was Dana Rourke. She was 41 years old. She coached her daughter's soccer team on Saturdays, and she had a reputation in the federal building that was specific and consistent. She didn't settle, and she didn't stop. Vivian had never contacted her, had never planned to, because she'd had Owen's federal channel, and it had seemed cleaner. Now she had nothing except Dana Rourke, and 18 days and a call record that was the foundation of everything. She looked up at Owen. I need to start over, she said. Different channel. Someone Kraft has never touched. At this point, I know what point we're at. Her voice was quiet and precise and completely without the quality that fear produces in voices. The slight elevation, the compression. I have 18 days and I have documentation and I have an originating phone number for a call that connects Adrian Viscari directly to conspiracy, fraud, and solicitation to commit murder. That call is on record with a carrier. A federal subpoena reaches that record in 72 hours. Owen looked at her. You've been holding that since October, he said. Since October, she confirmed. Why didn't you? Because I didn't know yet who to trust. She picked up her coffee cup. I'm still not entirely sure, but I'm out of time and out of options, and you're what I have. He was quiet for a moment. Dana Rourke, she said. Northern District. Do you know her? By reputation. Is she clean? He thought about it for a long moment. The kind of long moment that meant he was actually thinking, not performing deliberation. As far as I know, he said, she's never been given a reason not to be. Vivian nodded. Then we have 18 days, she said, to give her one hell of a reason. Outside the diner window, December pressed down on Pilsen. The gray sky, the salt-scarred sidewalks, a kid on a bicycle navigating the slush at the corner with the focused determination of someone who had somewhere to be. The ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what lived underneath it. Vivian Cross put on her coat. She had 18 days to dismantle an empire with nothing but what she'd built herself. And somewhere in the Michigan Avenue building, in a vault on a floor that didn't officially exist, Adrian Vescari was already moving his pieces toward a board he believed she couldn't see. He was wrong. She buttoned her coat to the throat, picked up the prepaid phone, and walked out of the diner into the December cold without looking back. She called Dana Rourke's direct office line at 4:15 that afternoon from a payphone outside a currency exchange on Blue Island Avenue, one of the last working payphones in the city. She'd located it 2 weeks ago for exactly this contingency. The call went to voicemail. She left 12 seconds of message, nothing more. A name, a case reference number from the Meridian filing, and a single sentence. I have the originating call record that identifies the Vescari organization's leadership. I'm an attorney. I'll call back tomorrow at the same time. She hung up. She stood on Blue Island Avenue in the last gray light of December and felt the specific quality of a door closing behind her. Not the door of an exit, but the door of a room she'd just committed to finishing what she'd started inside. There was no retrieving the voicemail, no pulling back the name or the case reference. Dana Rourke would run both within the hour. She'd find Vivian Cross, attorney, Harmon and Wells. She'd find the Meridian matter. She'd find the Vescari group connection, and she'd either make the call that mattered or she wouldn't. Vivian had spent 8 weeks building a structure that had been partially compromised from underneath her. What she had left was the foundation she'd poured herself before anyone else had been in the room. The call record, the financial documentation, her own legal work product turned against the man who'd weaponized it, and the wedding necklace in the jewelry box at home, which she was going to wear on January 18th, not as a symbol of what had been taken from her, but as a declaration of what she had refused to become. She had 17 days. She walked to the L station and took the train north and watched the city pass in the windows, the rooftops, the water towers, the lit windows of ordinary lives stacked against the winter sky. And she thought about Vivian Cross at 26 in a ballroom at the Langham Hotel, cautious and sharp, and not yet understanding what patience in a man who watched the board rather than the pieces actually meant. She thought about what that woman would think of the woman on the train. She thought she'd understand her completely. The train moved north through the dark, and Vivian Cross sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward and thought about 18 days, and Dana Rourke, and a ballroom full of people who were about to witness something none of them had been invited to see. Dana Rourke called back in 19 hours. Not at 4:15 the following day. At 11 in the morning, Vivian's office line, which meant she'd run the name, found Harmon and Wells and decided a direct approach was faster than waiting. Vivian picked up on the second ring. Ms. Cross. The voice was flat, Midwestern, with the particular compression of someone who had learned to remove affect from professional communication the way you remove fat from stock. Not because affect was useless, but because it clouded the flavor of what you actually needed. You left me a voicemail yesterday. I did. The Meridian case reference. That's a closed commercial transaction. The transaction is closed. What it facilitated is not. A pause. Brief. I'm going to need you to come in. I'm not coming into a federal building until I understand the chain of custody for whatever I bring with me. Specifically, I need to know which supervisory personnel have access to organized crime case files in the Northern District. Another pause. Longer. The quality of a person recalibrating. That's an unusual request, Rourke said. I'm aware. It implies you have a concern about internal exposure. It implies I've done my research, and I'm not going to spend 8 weeks building something only to hand it to the wrong person. Vivian kept her voice level. I'll meet you outside the building, neutral location. You, one other person you trust completely, and nobody else. After that conversation, if you want me to come in formally, I will. The silence on Rourke's end was the silence of someone deciding whether this was a credible witness or a paranoid one. Tomorrow, Rourke said. Noon. There's a coffee shop on Adams, half a block west of the Dirksen building. I'll be alone. I'll find it, Vivian said. She hung up and sat at her desk and looked at the Kensington file open in front of her. A real case, a real client, a deposition scheduled for Thursday that she would prepare for tonight because she was still an attorney and her clients were still her responsibility. And she thought about the 17 days left and felt the countdown. The way you feel the approach of something large and fast, not as abstraction, but as physical pressure. Dana Rourke was smaller than Vivian had expected. That was the first thing, not the handshake or the eyes or the way she looked at Vivian's face when she sat down, but the fact that she was perhaps 5'3" in flat shoes and had the kind of compact, economical, physical presence of someone who had stopped performing stature a long time ago because she'd found it unnecessary. She was 41 and looked it, not badly, but honestly, the face of someone who had put in the hours without pretending otherwise. She looked at Vivian for a long moment before she said anything. You're his wife, she said, for approximately another 17 days. He's filing. And before or immediately after, he plans to eliminate everyone who can connect him to the operational side of his organization. That list includes me. Rourke wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She had a small scar on her left index finger, old, the kind you get from something domestic and careless. And Vivian found herself noticing it the way you notice specific details when your nervous system is running at capacity and cataloging everything as potential information. Walk me through what you have, Rourke said. Vivian walked her through it. All of it. The call record, the shell company documentation, the Meridian connection, the offshore restructuring, the amended therapy records, the gala timeline. She held back nothing except Owen Mercer's name and Kraft's. She needed Rourke to build her own picture before introducing the complication of a compromised federal contact. Rourke listened the way Owen listened, without interrupting, with a focused stillness that was professional rather than personal. But where Owen had the stillness of a hunter, Rourke had the stillness of a builder, someone assembling rather than tracking. When Vivian finished, Rourke was quiet for perhaps 20 seconds. The call record, she said. You still have it. Carrier record, October 14th, 11 minutes 43 seconds. The originating number is registered to a burner purchased in Waukegan, but the cell tower data places it within 2 blocks of the Viscari Group's Michigan Avenue building at the time of the call. I have a legal analysis connecting the number to 3 other calls made from the same device over 14 months, all to numbers registered to shell entities in the Viscari structure. You did that yourself. I'm a corporate attorney. Following money through shell structures is my professional vocabulary. Rourke looked at her. Why didn't you come to us in October? Because I didn't know who inside your building was safe. And now you do? Now I know who isn't, Vivian said, which is a different calculation. She told her about Kraft then, kept it factual, stripped of interpretation, the Celeste party, the familiarity of the greeting, Owen's assessment. She watched Rourke's face during this and saw something tighten around the eyes. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a pattern that had been present in peripheral vision for longer than it had been looked at directly. Kraft has oversight of 3 active organized crime investigations in this district, Rourke said. Her voice had gone quieter. If what you're describing is accurate, I'm not describing. I'm reporting what I observed. Then I need to move very carefully. Rourke looked out the window at Adams Street. January gray, pedestrians in heavy coats. The federal building half a block away with its flags snapping in the lake wind. How much time do we have? The gala is January 18th, 17 days. The vault, the primary documentation source, will be accessible in the window before the gala, I believe around January 15th, when he moves materials in preparation for the announcement. You believe? Based on 8 weeks of observing his operational pattern, I'd put it at 85%. Rourke turned back from the window. I can build a subpoena for the carrier records in 48 hours. If the tower data holds, I have probable cause for a warrant. The warrant needs to be routed outside Kraft's visibility. I know how to route a warrant. A pause. Ms. Cross, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Your own legal work is in the meridian chain of title. You understand what that means for your exposure. I understand it completely. And you're still here. I'm still here because the alternative is letting him use my work I did in good faith, to launder criminal proceeds indefinitely while he files fraudulent medical documentation to have me declared incompetent and takes everything I have. She held Rourke's gaze. I'll take my exposure. I've reviewed it. I'll take it. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. I'll be in touch in 48 hours, she said. The subpoena came back clean in 60 hours. The carrier data was everything Vivian had said it was. Tower placement, call duration, device registration trail. Rourke called her on the 3rd of January with a voice that had changed frequency, the particular shift that happens when a person moves from evaluating a situation to being inside it. We have the warrant, she said. I've built a 4-person team, people I've worked with for years, none of whom have had case contact with Kraft's division. We're treating this as a compartmentalized operation. The vault, Vivian said. I need a legal pathway into the vault. What you've described is a room in a private commercial building with biometric security. I can't execute a search warrant on a room I can't document the existence of. I can document it. She'd been thinking about this. I've been inside it. I can provide an affidavit describing the room's contents with sufficient specificity to establish probable cause for the warrant. The building's certificate of occupancy lists Suite 4401 as unoccupied storage. A discrepancy between the occupancy record and the room's actual use, established through my affidavit, gives you the pathway. You'd be putting your name on a federal affidavit describing unauthorized access to your husband's business premises. I was inside the room with his knowledge 4 years ago. My access wasn't unauthorized. The second time I was retrieving a document from an adjacent suite using a valid access code. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You've thought this through. I've thought everything through, Vivian said. What's your timeline for the vault warrant? If you file the affidavit by Friday, I can have the warrant by the 12th. That gives us a 3-day window before your January 15th estimate. File it, Vivian said. She told Adrian on the 7th of January that she was going to a conference in Washington. 2 days, a financial litigation symposium she attended every other year. He said that was fine. She could see him calculating something behind the neutrality of his face, and she looked back at him with the composed warmth she'd been wearing for 3 months, and thought about the affidavit she'd filed that morning, and thought about the warrant Rourke was building, and thought about 15 days. She flew to Washington and stayed 1 night in a hotel, and attended 3 hours of the actual conference because the registration would show, and then she came home and went to the office and worked on the Kensington case and deposited the performance of ordinary professional life into the account she'd been maintaining since October. On the 10th of January, she met Owen for the last time at the diner in Pilsen. She told him about Rourke. She told him about the warrant. She told him that the operation was moving on a track that no longer required him, which was both true and a form of protection. If Kraft became aware that Owen had been working against the organization's interests, Owen's safety became a variable she couldn't control. He listened. He nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee. You don't need me to tell you this was the right call, he said. No. I should have verified Kraft more carefully before I brought him in. You trusted someone you'd known for 22 years, she said. That's not stupidity. It's the thing they depend on. He looked up at her. You're going to be in the room when it happens. Yes. Rourke approved that? Rourke understands that I'm the only person in that ballroom who knows where everybody is buried, which means I'm the most valuable set of eyes she has on the ground until her team is in position. A pause. She didn't love it. She approved it. Owen nodded. He looked at his notebook on the table, and then he picked it up and put it back in his coat pocket. Be careful, he said. It was the first time in 3 months he'd said something that sounded entirely personal rather than operational, and she received it as such. I will, she said. What? January 15th came in gray and cold, the sky pressing low over the lake. The the city moving through its Friday with no knowledge of what was happening on the 44th floor of a building on South Michigan Avenue. Rourke's team went in at 11:18, 40 minutes after the building's security log showed Adrian Viscari accessing Suite 4401. They had the warrant, a forensic documentation specialist, and a federal marshal for legal continuity. They had the access code, not from the compromised device Owen had given her, but from a fresh warrant served on the building's security contractor who had provided the override sequence within 2 hours of being served. Vivian knew all of this from Rourke's 7 a.m. briefing. She spent the day at the office. She answered emails and reviewed a contract and ate lunch at her desk, and at 3:15 her phone buzzed with a text from a number she recognized as one of Rourke's team burners. 2 words, Vault confirmed. She set the phone face down on her desk and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she opened them and went back to work. The gala was in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel. The irony of the name was not lost on her. On the evening of January 18th. 500 guests, Chicago's institutional elite, a benefit for the Viscari Foundation's education initiative that had been in the calendar for 8 months and which Adrian had repurposed, Vivian knew, as the stage for his personal announcement. She dressed at home. The black gown she'd had altered in December, a silhouette that was architectural rather than decorative, the kind of dress that occupied space with intention. The wedding necklace, the strand of diamonds he'd called a Viscari family piece, she took from the jewelry box and held in her palm for a moment, the stones cold against her skin, and then she fastened it at the back of her neck and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a woman attending a gala. She looked nothing like what she was. She took a cab rather than the car. The cab dropped her at the hotel entrance at 8:15, and she walked through the doors alone, checked her coat, accepted a champagne glass from a passing tray, and entered the ballroom. It was everything Adrian did well. The scale, the precision, the ambient warmth of 500 well-dressed people in a room where the flowers cost more than most people's rent. She moved through it with the ease she'd spent 9 years developing, touching shoulders, exchanging the social currency of names and brief, genuine-seeming warmth, working the room the way they'd always worked rooms together, except she was doing it alone, and she was doing it as reconnaissance. She clocked Rourke's people within 12 minutes. She'd been told there would be 6 of them, federal agents in evening wear, the kind of undercover presence that required actors rather than operators. She found 4 of the 6. The other 2 she assumed were positioned outside or in service areas, and she left them unfound rather than risk the tell of searching. She found Celeste at 9:10 near the bar on the east wall in a champagne-colored gown that was either coincidence or a statement, talking to a city alderman with the particular animation of someone performing excitement while running a different calculation entirely. Their eyes met across the room. Celeste smiled. Vivian smiled back and raised her glass a centimeter and kept moving. She found Adrian at 9:25. He was near the stage talking to 3 men she recognized as investors from the group's legitimate portfolio, and he looked the way he always looked at these events. Inhabited, magnetic, the kind of man who seemed most fully himself in rooms full of people watching him. He saw her from across the room, and something moved through his face that she read now with the accuracy of someone who had spent 3 months learning to see past the surface. Relief. Very brief. The relief of a man who'd been uncertain whether the variable he'd calculated as controlled was going to appear where it was supposed to appear. She was where she was supposed to be. She smiled at him across the ballroom, and he smiled back and excused himself from his conversation and crossed to her. "You look extraordinary," he said. "You've used that line before," she said. He laughed, easy, warm, the laugh she'd fallen for 9 years ago, and leaned in to kiss her cheek, and she held her ground and received it and smelled his cologne and thought about a kitchen in October and a phone and 11 minutes and 43 seconds. "Enjoying yourself?" he said. "It's a beautiful event," she said. "Your team outdid themselves." "They usually do." He looked at her necklace, the diamonds, his family piece around her throat. Something moved behind his eyes that she catalogued without reacting to. "You wore it." "Special occasion," she said. He held her gaze for a beat that was perhaps 1 second longer than social convention required, and in that second she could feel the recalculation happening behind his face, The variable checking, the confirmation that everything was where he'd positioned it, and then he smiled and touched her elbow lightly and said, "Stay close tonight. I have an announcement I'd like you to be present for." "Of course," she said. He moved back toward the stage. She watched him go. She checked the time on her phone, 9:31, and sent a single character text to Rourke's number, a period. The signal they'd agreed on. She was in position, she was intact, the timeline was holding. Rourke's response came in 11 seconds. Also a period. Teams in position, holding for the announcement. At 9:55, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly, and the MC, a local television news anchor who did this circuit every year, brought the room to attention with the professional warmth of a man who did warmth professionally, and the program began. Remarks from the Foundation's director. A video about the education initiative. Applause, genuine and otherwise. The catering staff gliding through the dimmed edges of the room with practiced silence. Vivian stood near the center of the room, champagne glass untouched since 9:15, and watched the stage. At 10:22, Adrian Viscari stepped to the podium. He was composed and polished, and he spoke about the Foundation's work with the fluency of a man who had delivered versions of this speech for years, genuinely invested in its surface, because the surface was real and the surface was useful, and Adrian Viscari had never done anything that served only one purpose. He got the laughs he aimed for. He got the sustained applause for the scholarship announcement. He was, by any observable metric, a man at the pinnacle of his constructed world. Then he paused. The pause was theatrical, just long enough to shift the room's frequency from program attention to something more alert. "Before I close," he said, "I want to share something personal, something I should have said publicly a long time ago." He found her in the crowd. She was not hard to find. She was exactly where he expected her to be, center room, the composed wife in the black dress with the family necklace, the woman he had already disposed of in every way that mattered and needed only to dispose of publicly. "My wife, Vivian," he said, and the room found her, 500 pairs of eyes turning with the instinct of people following a host's direction, "has been my partner and my foundation for 9 years. And it's because I respect what we've built that I want to be honest tonight, with her and with all of you." He paused again. "Vivian and I have decided to end our marriage." The room absorbed this the way rooms absorb personal announcements. A held breath, a ripple of whispered reaction, 500 people recalibrating the social geometry of what they were witnessing. "And I want to introduce the woman who has been central to my life, and who will stand beside me as I move forward." He gestured toward the east side of the ballroom. Celeste was already moving, the champagne gown catching the stage light, her face arranged in an expression of composed joy that Vivian could read from 30 feet as the performance of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for a long time. The room was fully silent now. Vivian looked at Adrian at the podium. He was looking at her with the face of a man savoring the specific satisfaction of a plan at its completion, the moment of closing when every variable has arrived at its designated position. She held his gaze. And then every screen in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel changed. The video wall behind the stage, the display monitors at the bar stations, the screens that had been showing the Foundation logo in tasteful rotation around the room's perimeter. Every screen simultaneously replaced its content with a single image, a financial document, dense with transaction data, a wire transfer record showing 9 figures moving through 3 shell entities in 48 hours. The room took 2 seconds to understand what it was looking at. Then the second document appeared. Then the third. Bank transfers, Shell Corporation ownership chains, an audio waveform. And then the audio itself. Adrian's voice. Unmistakable, coming through the ballroom sound system with the clarity of a recording made in a quiet car on a November afternoon. Vivian suspects what I allow her to suspect. That's always been the arrangement. The ballroom went the kind of silent that happens when 500 people stop breathing at the same moment. Celeste had stopped moving. She was standing in the middle of the room in her champagne gown with her face in a configuration it had never been designed to hold publicly, stripped for one unguarded second of every layer of performance. Adrian Vescari stood at the podium. He was looking at the screens. Then he looked at Vivian. She looked back at him across the silent ballroom with the wedding necklace at her throat and her champagne glass held loosely at her side, and her face composed into something that was not a smile and not a threat, but the expression of a woman who had finished building something and was watching it stand. She heard the doors, all 4 sets of ballroom doors opening simultaneously, the sharp authoritative sound of federal agents moving into a room with purpose, and the first voice, Rourke's, clear and carrying, cutting through the frozen silence of 500 people who had come to a charity gala and were leaving as witnesses to something none of them would ever fully describe correctly, but all of them would spend years trying. Adrian Vescari, federal agents, step away from the podium. Adrian's hands were flat on the podium. He was looking at Vivian. She watched his face move through the stages, the disbelief, the calculation, the search for an exit that wasn't there, and finally, underneath all of it, something she hadn't expected and couldn't fully name. Not rage, not the cold fury of a man betrayed, something older and quieter than that, something that looked for one fraction of a second almost like recognition. He had underestimated her. He knew it. The ballroom erupted, not all at once, but in a cascade. Men near the exits moving for them, the instinct of people adjacent to criminal enterprise when federal presence arrives, the shouts of agents cutting through the noise, Celeste's voice somewhere behind Vivian saying something that became inaudible in the chaos, the sound of a chair falling, glass breaking, the particular acoustic chaos of a controlled situation fracturing at its edges. Vivian did not move. She stood in the center of the room while it detonated around her, and she watched Adrian step back from the podium, not toward the agents, not toward her, but toward the stage-left exit. The door she knew from the building schematics led to a service corridor, and from there to the hotel's lower level and the loading dock and the street. She knew because she'd studied the building schematics in December. She knew because she'd told Rourke about the service corridor. She knew because she'd planned for exactly this, and Rourke had 2 agents in that corridor already. But she also knew, because she'd spent 9 years learning this man's reflexes, that Adrian Vescari did not, when cornered, do the thing you predicted. He did the thing adjacent to the thing you predicted, the half-step lateral move that used your own preparation against you. He wasn't going to the service corridor. He was moving toward the stage, and the stage had a door she hadn't thought about, a door she couldn't see from her position, and she didn't have a radio and she didn't have Rourke's ear, and she had approximately 4 seconds before he reached it. She set down the champagne glass on the nearest table and moved. Through the fracturing crowd, against the current of people trying to orient themselves, past a federal agent who was managing the east exit and who she moved around rather than through, toward the stage with the specific velocity of someone who had made the calculation and committed to it. And she hit the stage steps at a run and came through the side door into the backstage corridor 12 feet behind Adrian Vescari as he reached the far end where a stairwell door stood open, a rectangle of concrete gray stairwell light, and he put his hand on the frame and turned. He saw her. They were alone in the corridor, the ballroom chaos a muffled roar behind the walls, and for the first time in 3 months, for the first time, she understood, in 9 years, there was nothing between them but the distance of 12 feet and the absence of every performance either of them had ever deployed in the other's presence. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the podium, but closer now, stripped of the room and the crowd and the architecture of the life he'd built. "You built all of it," he said. Not a question. "All of it," she said. He looked at the necklace at her throat. Something crossed his face. "Vivian, don't," she said. His jaw tightened. His hand was still on the stairwell doorframe, and she could see him calculating. The stairwell, her, the distance, what was in the stairwell and what wasn't. And she held his eyes and did not move, and thought about October, and a kitchen, and a bedroom ceiling, and 8 years of a grief that had been manufactured and filed as a weapon. And she felt none of the things she might have expected to feel, and everything that she had been moving toward since the moment she'd set her phone face down on her office desk and pressed her forehead against cold glass 40 stories above the lake. "It's over," she said. He looked at her. Behind the walls, she could hear footsteps on the stairwell. Rourke's people, coming up from the lower level, the corridor closing from both directions. And she watched Adrian Vescari hear them too. watched the last calculation, move through his face and arrive at its conclusion. The conclusion she'd built the entire architecture of the last 3 months to make inevitable. There was nowhere left to go. His hand dropped from the door frame. He stood in the corridor with the stairwell light behind him and the ballroom chaos behind her and 12 feet of concrete between them, and for one moment he was not the Don of Chicago's most feared organization or the CEO of a global investment empire or the man who had engineered 9 years of her life as a legal instrument. He was just a man in an expensive suit in a service corridor who had run out of board. The stairwell door opened from the other side. 2 federal agents came through with the clipped efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this. One had his credentials forward before he'd fully cleared the doorway. Mr. Viscari, hands where I can see them. Adrian didn't look at them. He was still looking at Vivian. She held his gaze and did not look away and did not move. And in the last 3 seconds before the agents reached him, she watched his face do the one thing she hadn't planned for and couldn't have. It went quiet. Not the controlled neutrality she'd spent 9 years reading as composure. Something beneath that. Something that had no performance left in it. I taught you too well, he said. No, she said. You taught me exactly enough. The agents reached him. He didn't resist. He put his hands up with the precise economy of a man who understood the difference between a battle that could be won and one that was already a historical fact. And as they moved him toward the stairwell door, he kept his eyes on her until the angle of the corridor took him out of her sight line. Then he was gone. Vivian stood alone in the backstage corridor of the Meridian Hotel, with the muffled sound of the ballroom beyond the walls and the stairwell light throwing a pale rectangle on the concrete floor. And she breathed, in, hold, out, and felt the specific quality of a weight that had been structural for so long, its removal was its own kind of vertigo. She reached up and touched the necklace at her throat, the diamonds cold under her fingertips. Then she turned and walked back toward the light. The ballroom took 40 minutes to fully clear. Vivian stood near the east wall and watched it happen. The federal agents working the room with the methodical patience of people executing a plan that had been rehearsed, the guests corralled into cooperative clusters, the catering staff directed to a holding area near the kitchen. The sound system finally cut so that Adrian's voice stopped playing through the speakers and the room settled into the ambient noise of controlled chaos finding its floor. She watched it the way she'd watched a lot of things in the past 3 months, with the full attention of someone who understood that the details mattered, and the details were not finished yet. Rourke found her at 10:58. She looked like someone who had been running hard for a long time and was choosing not to show it, which Vivian recognized as a professional discipline they shared. There was a radio in her hand and a slight flush along her jaw that might have been exertion or adrenaline or both, and she looked at Vivian for a moment before she spoke with the assessing quality of someone confirming that a variable had come through intact. He's in custody, she said. 11 of his captains are in custody or being picked up in the next hour. The financial injunctions were filed at 10:30. Every Viscari Group account is frozen as of right now. The vault documentation, Vivian said, authenticated and in federal custody since the 15th. We have enough in those ledgers alone for a RICO case that will take 3 years to fully prosecute. A pause. It's solid, Vivian. What you built, the carrier records, the Meridian chain, the shell documentation. It's the architecture the vault evidence hangs on. Without your work, we have a complicated financial crime. With it, we have the complete picture. Vivian looked at the ballroom around her. The overturned chairs near the exit, a champagne glass on its side under a table. The video wall still displaying the last document image before someone had thought to cut the feed. A wire transfer record in frozen blue light above an empty stage. Celeste, she said. She's being processed. Her attorney arrived 20 minutes ago. Corporate defense, white shoe firm. She'll negotiate. Rourke's voice was even. She has significant exposure. The information she passed from your firm's files enabled the operational security of the organization for at least 6 years. She'll give testimony or she'll spend a decade in federal prison. Those are the choices. She'll give testimony, Vivian said. Probably. She's been calculating exits since the day I met her. She'll find the one that costs her the least. Rourke looked at her. You knew her for 14 years. I knew a performance for 14 years, Vivian said. I don't know how much of the person was underneath it. Maybe nothing. Maybe more than I want to give her credit for. She paused. It doesn't matter now. It may matter at sentencing. Then it'll matter at sentencing. Tonight it doesn't. Rourke nodded slowly. Then, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. Full debrief, formal statement, the whole process. It's going to be a long day. I know. And Vivian. Rourke held her gaze. The Meridian exposure, your work product in the chain of title. I've reviewed it with my team. The evidence is clear that your participation was in good faith, that you had no knowledge of the underlying criminal purpose, and that you came forward voluntarily with the documentation that enabled this prosecution. I'm not in the business of burning witnesses who built my case. I appreciate that. It's not a favor. It's the law, correctly applied. I know, Vivian said. I appreciate it anyway. Rourke almost smiled. Almost. Then her radio crackled and she was moving again back into the machinery of what she'd set in motion, and Vivian watched her go and stood alone in the emptying ballroom of the Meridian Hotel and felt the first real stillness she'd felt since October. She took a cab home. The house on Astor Street was dark and quiet, the way houses go quiet when whatever animated them has been removed. She turned on the kitchen light and stood in it and looked at the counter where the candle usually sat. She'd stopped lighting it sometime in November, she realized, without consciously deciding to. And she looked at the island where they'd eaten dinners, and the cabinet where his preferred coffee was still stacked, and the window above the sink where the dark of the January garden was barely distinguishable from the dark of the sky above it. She made tea. Not because she wanted tea, but because making tea was something to do with her hands, and she needed something to do with her hands for the next few minutes while her nervous system found its new baseline. She sat at the island and held the mug and thought about nothing specific for a while, which was its own kind of extraordinary. She'd forgotten what it felt like to not be thinking about the next step. After a while, she went upstairs and showered and put on clothes that were not the black gown and went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen island again and let the house be quiet around her and let herself be a person sitting in a kitchen in the middle of the night rather than an operation in progress. Her phone had 23 unread messages. She looked at the notification number and put the phone face down. Not yet. Teet. She called her parents in the morning. Her mother answered on the second ring and said her name in the particular voice that mothers have, the voice that contains the full history of a person in a single syllable. And Vivian sat in her car in the parking structure near the federal building and said, I'm okay. I need you to hear that first. I'm okay. Her mother said, What happened? A lot, Vivian said. I'll explain everything. Not on the phone. Can you and Dad come to Chicago this weekend? We'll be there tomorrow, her mother said, which was the answer Vivian had known she'd give, and which hit her, unexpectedly, in a place she'd been keeping sealed for 3 months. Tomorrow's good, she said. Her voice was steady. Mostly. Vivian? I'm okay, Mom. I know you are, her mother said. You always are. That's not the same as being fine. Vivian sat with that for a moment. No, she said. It's not. She went in for her debrief. Yeah. The debrief took 11 hours across 2 days. Rourke's team was thorough and professional and occasionally exhausting in the way that thorough professional people are when they need every detail and you are the detail's source. Vivian gave them everything. The October call, the research methodology, the library computers, the prepaid phones, the Hyde Park coffee shops, the safety deposit box, the device placements, Owen Mercer's involvement, Kraft's appearance at Celeste's party, the full accounting of every step she'd taken from the moment she'd set the phone face down on her desk. She did not minimize her own actions, and she did not embellish them. She gave the facts in chronological sequence with the precision of someone who had spent her professional life understanding what testimony needed to be and what it could not afford to be. On the second day during a break, Rourke brought her coffee and sat across from her in the small conference room and said, Can I ask you something off the record? Go ahead. When you were in that corridor, after the ballroom, before my agents came through the stairwell door, she held her mug with both hands. What were you going to do if he'd run? Vivian thought about it honestly. Stop him, she said. How? However I needed to. Rourke looked at her for a moment. That's not a lawyer's answer. No, Vivian agreed. It isn't. She saw Celeste once more. It was 3 weeks after the gala, a Thursday afternoon in February. Gray sky and a cold that had settled into the city with the permanence of a long-term tenant. Vivian had been called to the federal building to review a preliminary evidence summary, and she was leaving through the main entrance when she saw Celeste in the lobby with her attorney, the white shoe partner, immaculate in a way that money purchased and crisis didn't fully erase, moving toward the elevator bank. Celeste saw her at the same moment. They were perhaps 15 feet apart. The lobby moved around them with the indifferent traffic of a federal building. Attorneys, clerks, security personnel, the ordinary machinery of institutional process. Neither of them moved for a moment. Celeste looked the way people look when the performance has been dismantled, and what's underneath is not nothing but is smaller and more frightened than the performance had suggested. She was still beautiful. That was somehow the most honest thing about her. The beauty was structural, not performed, and it persisted even now, even here, which seemed to Vivian like a particular kind of cruelty that the universe had arranged without malice. "Vivian," she said. "Celeste." Her attorney put a hand on her arm, the professional warning of someone who did not want their client speaking to a federal witness in a federal building lobby, and Celeste looked at the hand and then back at Vivian. "I'm sorry," she said. The words landed in the space between them. Vivian looked at her and thought about 14 years and what they'd actually contained, the real conversations threaded through the extracted ones, the moments of genuine warmth she couldn't fully discredit even now, because discrediting them entirely would require a certainty she didn't have, and maybe didn't want to have, because the alternative, that none of it had been real, that 14 years of friendship had been purely instrumental from the first day, was a weight she wasn't going to carry. She didn't know the full truth of what Celeste had been, or when she'd stopped being it, or whether there had ever been a version of her that had meant the friendship without also mining it. She'd probably never know. That was its own thing to live with. "I know," Vivian said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was the acknowledgement of a fact, that the words had been said, that they'd been heard, that the accounting between them existed even if it would never fully balance. And she left it at that because she'd learned, in the past 4 months, the difference between what needed to be resolved and what needed to be released. She walked out of the federal building into the February cold. The Viscari Group's collapse took 8 months to complete. Not because the evidence was insufficient. The vault documentation alone was catastrophic for the organization's legal position. But because dismantling an empire that had been built over 3 decades, through 9 layers of legal architecture, with tendrils and political offices and union structures and legitimate businesses across 6 states, required the kind of sustained institutional effort that couldn't be rushed without breaking things that needed to remain intact. Vivian followed it the way she followed all large legal proceedings, with the attention of a professional and the particular additional attention of someone with personal stakes, which she'd learned were not the same thing and had to be managed separately. Adrian's trial was scheduled for the following autumn. His legal team was formidable and expensive and filed every motion available to them with the methodical aggression of people who understood their client was facing decades and had structured their fee accordingly. The motions failed one by one. The evidence was too complete, too authenticated, too multiply-sourced for any single challenge to unravel it. Vivian knew this because she'd built it that way, and she watched the motions fail with the detached satisfaction of a person reviewing their own work and finding it held. He did not attempt to contact her. She thought he might. Through attorneys, through the civil proceedings that ran parallel to the criminal case, through some channel that his resources could still purchase, despite the frozen accounts. He didn't. She didn't know whether that was tactical discipline or something else, and she stopped trying to determine which. Samuel Kraft resigned from the Bureau in February, citing health reasons, 3 days before an internal affairs investigation that had been quietly building since Rourke's team had flagged the Celeste connection would have reached him formally. The resignation came with a negotiated agreement that his cooperation with the investigation into the Viscari organization's federal infiltration would be factored into whatever came next for him. His daughter Sophie finished her graduate degree in Boston in May. Vivian knew this because she'd looked it up once and then stopped looking. Owen Mercer she met for coffee in March, a real coffee shop rather than the Pilsen Diner, a place in Lincoln Square with good light and no ambient significance. He looked like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. Not lighter, exactly, because weight that long carried leaves structural changes, but differently arranged. "How are you?" he said. Not with the professional inflection of someone asking as prelude, but actually asking. "I'm figuring that out," she said. "You?" "Same." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "I testified in front of the Oversight Committee last week. Everything, well, the investigation, the shutdown, Kraft, all of it, on the record. How was that?" 22 years late, he said. "Better than never." They sat for a while and talked about things that were not the operation. A book he'd been reading, a neighborhood restaurant she'd tried, the way Chicago handled February, which was badly and with a certain civic pride about the badness. It was a conversation between two people who had been through something and were now on the other side of it, which was its own kind of territory, unfamiliar and requiring navigation. When they parted on the street outside, Owen put out his hand. She shook it. He held it a beat longer than a handshake required. "You did something most people don't do," he said. "What's that?" "You held on to yourself the whole way through." She thought about that on the walk to her car. She wasn't certain it was true. She'd felt herself shift and compress and harden in ways she hadn't fully accounted for yet, ways she'd need to spend time with in the months ahead. Holding on to yourself and being changed by what you held on through were not incompatible, but they required different kinds of attention. She was still working out which parts were which. She left Harmon and Wells in April. Not under pressure, the firm had handled the revelation of Adrian's crimes with the careful diplomatic distance of an institution protecting itself, which she'd expected, and there had been conversations in March that were professional and thorough and resulted in a mutual understanding that her future and the firm's future were probably better served by diverging cleanly. She'd been offered a substantial settlement package. She negotiated it upward by 30% as a matter of principle and signed the paperwork on a Tuesday, and walked out of the building on South Wacker with a banker's box and the particular lightness of a person who has finished something. She stood on the sidewalk with the box under her arm and looked at the building. 22 floors of glass and steel, the place she'd arrived at 24 years old with the clean hunger of someone who understood what she was capable of and wanted the room to prove it. And she felt the weight of a decade's worth of work inside those walls, the real work, the work she'd done before any of it had been compromised, and she let herself acknowledge it as hers. Then she put the box in her car and drove. The foundation was her idea, assembled over 6 months of conversation with legal colleagues, survivor advocates, financial crime specialists, and 2 federal prosecutors who'd spent careers watching people emerge from the wreckage of coercive control with nothing, no money, no documentation, no understanding of the legal mechanisms that had been used against them and the ones that could be used for them. She called it the Cross Foundation, which her mother said was either bold or unavoidable, and Vivian said both, and her mother laughed. Its focus was specific: legal representation and financial recovery for survivors of financially coercive relationships and organized crime-adjacent abuse. The population of people who fell into the gap between domestic violence resources and federal financial crime prosecution, people whose situations required the kind of legal sophistication that free clinics couldn't provide and private firms wouldn't take on contingency. She knew this population existed because she'd spent 8 months being served by that gap and had the receipts. She hired 4 attorneys in the first 6 months, 2 paralegals, a forensic accountant named Patricia, who had come from the federal prosecutor's office, and who shared Vivian's specific gift for finding the thing embedded in a document that wasn't supposed to be found. She rented office space in the West Loop, a floor of a building with good light, and a conference room large enough to hold difficult conversations in, and she built the intake process from scratch with the precision of someone who understood that the process was itself a form of care. The first client was a woman from the Southwest Side named Irene, 47 years old, whose husband had spent 11 years rerouting her salary through a business entity she'd believed was jointly owned, and which she'd discovered, upon filing for divorce, was solely in his name and had been used to shelter assets she'd helped generate. The case took 9 months. Vivian argued 2 of the motions herself. They recovered 63% of the concealed assets and established a legal precedent in the Cook County Circuit that 3 other attorneys had already cited in subsequent cases. Irene sent her a card when it was over, a plain card, no embellishment, and inside it wrote, "You made me feel like I wasn't crazy. That was the first thing. Then you made them pay. Thank you." Vivian pinned it to the board above her desk and looked at it sometimes when the work was grinding and the institutional resistance was exhausting, and the gap between what needed to exist and what did exist felt too wide to bridge in a professional lifetime. She looked at it and went back to work. The ring. She'd thought about it for months, what to do with it, when the ritual dimension of a gesture she didn't want to perform as theater but couldn't reduce to simple logistics either. It wasn't just a ring, it was a strand of diamonds he'd called a family piece, which she'd since verified was not a family piece at all, but something purchased 6 weeks before their first anniversary, and the gap between the story and the object was the same gap that ran through the entire architecture of 9 years. And she'd spent a long time deciding what that gap meant for what she did with what remained. She chose a Thursday evening in October, the anniversary of the call. She drove to the pedestrian bridge on the south branch of the river. The one near Ping Tom Park, where she used to run before running, felt like something she'd given up without noticing. It was just past 6, and the city was doing what Chicago does at 6 on an October evening. The light going copper and then gray, the river holding both colors at once, the buildings on either side throwing reflections that fractured in the current. She stood at the railing. She held the necklace in her palm and looked at it for a moment, the stones catching the last of the light, cold and clear and genuinely beautiful, which was not something she could hold against them. Beautiful things used as instruments of harm were still beautiful. That was something she'd had to learn to hold without resolving. She thought about the woman who'd worn this to a gala in January and stood in a ballroom and watched 9 years of engineered reality come apart at every seam simultaneously. She thought about the woman who'd stood in an office on October 14th and pressed her forehead against cold glass. She thought about the women who sat across from her in the West Loop conference room with their documents and their fear and their specific, resilient determination to understand what had been done to them and to recover what could be recovered and to live afterward as themselves rather than as the instrument of someone else's design. She opened her hand. The necklace caught the last light for one moment, a brief scatter of cold fire, and then it was gone, taken by the current, and the river moved on the way rivers move, without ceremony, without marking the addition of one small thing to everything it already carried. She stood at the railing for another minute with her hands loose at her sides and the October air coming off the water with the clean, specific cold of a city moving into its next season, and she breathed in, hold, out, and felt the shape of what was on the other side of the exhale. Not clean, not simple, not the uncomplicated freedom of a story that ended with justice distributed and damage repaired, and every cost fully accounted for. The damage was real, and it was hers, and she was going to be finding its dimensions for years, in the specific ways that you find the dimensions of damage, suddenly, sideways, in moments that don't announce themselves as significant until you're already inside them. But she was finding them as herself. That was the thing. That was the only thing, finally, that held when she pressed on it, that she'd gone through every inch of this as the person she actually was, not the person she'd been constructed to be, not the instrument, not the legal shield, not the grieving wife performing stability for an audience of one who was always evaluating the performance. Herself. Intact, changed, yes, harder in some places and more careful in others, and carrying the specific knowledge that the world contains people who will engineer your love as a mechanism of control and do it with such patience and precision that you won't see it until the accident that reveals it. That knowledge was not something she'd asked for and was not something she'd give back, because it lived in her now as the foundation of something useful. The foundation of the conference room in the West Loop and the 4 attorneys she'd hired and the Irene cases she'd take for the rest of her professional life. She pushed off the railing and turned back toward the park. The city was fully in its evening now. Lights coming on across the buildings, the river going dark beneath the bridges, the particular ambient sound of Chicago in autumn, which was wind and traffic and something underneath both. That was the sound of a city that had survived everything it had been given so far and intended to keep surviving. Vivian Cross walked back along the river path with her hands in her coat pockets, and her face into the wind and the ring no longer on her finger, and the necklace no longer at her throat, and nothing around her neck or on her hand that hadn't been put there by her own choosing. She walked toward her car. She had work tomorrow. She had work for a long time yet. The city moved around her the way it always moved, without ceremony, without memory, indifferent and alive. And she moved through it the same way, and the river behind her carried what it carried toward the lake, and the lake held it the way the lake held everything, which was completely and without judgment. And the night came down over Chicago the way night always came, and the story was finished.